Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. In tonight's programme, we'll be looking at the clashes between two rival Taliban groups in southern Afghanistan, which have resulted in the deaths of dozens of fighters from both sides. We'll also be looking at the meeting between US President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's their first meeting since relations deteriorated over the nuclear deal between the world powers and Iran. But first, in Burma, the opposition National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, has won the country's parliamentary elections by a landslide. Nathaniel Amos Sansom has this report.
The state of Burma, named Myanmar by the ruling government, has taken a further step towards democracy today, as the scale of the victory for the opposition National League for Democracy slowly became apparent in the country's first open elections for a quarter of a century. After voting yesterday in Yangon, NLD leader Aung San Suu Kyi was mobbed by supportive crowds, waiting outside the school building where she went to cast her vote. The democracy campaigner and one-time political prisoner under the military regime now looks set to hold a resounding mandate from the Burmese people. Despite a long history of repression, the chair of the country's Union Election Commission said the vote had been largely free and peaceful. While election observers fielded by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations largely agreed with this analysis, they also gave suggestions on how the voting process could be improved in the future.
If possible, maybe you have to do your survey according to the culture or the environment here. Just register one time for all level of houses in getting all the ballot paper, but with the different colors. The ballot paper with the different colors to avoid confusing.
With the final results still being steadily declared, the NLD is expected to win the largest share of votes cast by an electorate of almost 30 million. The governing Union Solidarity and Development Party, which was formed by the country's ruling military, looks set on the preliminary results to lose by a substantial margin, with the NLD predicting that it will take all but one seat in their stronghold of Yangon. But with the result comes a number of challenges ahead. The ruling military government remains in place and holds a quota of 56 seats already appointed to the new parliament. And despite the NLD's resounding victory, the military's National Defence and Security Council remains a more powerful body than the legislature itself. Questions also remain about the treatment of Muslim minority groups in the country. Human rights groups have been highly critical of the decision not to let Rohingya Muslims vote or to allow them to field candidates. Of the over 4,000 candidates who contested the elections, only a handful were Muslim and were fielded by smaller parties unlikely to gain representation, with even the opposition NLD party declining to put forward a Muslim candidate. Despite this, many Muslims in the country remained optimistic that there would be positive change. With the final results still coming in, the only thing that is certain is that the Burmese electorate have delivered a rebuke to the governing regime. But what happens now depends on how that same regime now responds to the results.
Now, you've been telling us your thoughts on those Burmese elections on Twitter. Luck Forger tweeted, "For decades, this brave woman has been such an inspiration, bearer of hope and peace. Congratulations, Burma. Love and support to Aung San Suu Kyi." Phil Robertson for Human Rights Watch, which has said that the electoral process is fundamentally flawed, has also been commenting. He tweets, "Great day for the people of Burma to seize control of their political destiny, but the army is still powerful behind the scenes." Adding to this, Zahid Khan said, "Shall democracy be in Burma or shall it be controlled democracy by generals with remote control?" Lastly, journalist Andy Metzger questions the victory in relation to the situation of the Rohingya following Aung San Suu Kyi's silence on the issue during the election campaign. He tweets, "We should soon see whether the opposition party in Burma will continue keeping Rohingya in concentration camps." Well, to discuss all this, I'm joined by Baroness Kinnock of Holyhead, who's co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Democracy in Burma. And from Bangkok in Thailand by Lilianne Fan from the Overseas Development Institute. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Baroness Kinnock, given that the military does still retain fundamental forms of power in this constitution, it matters whether or not this is a landslide or a lesser victory, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think that Aung San Suu Kyi is very, what she calls, defiant and determined, and Burma, I think, is emerging from 50 years of authoritarian rule. It's the first ever vote for the whole for a whole generation of Burmese citizens who've never had the opportunity to vote. And so, you know, I certainly welcome the NLD landslide, which I think it is. It's wonderful news. It's a step forward, but I still think that there are a lot of things that need to be done and questions which need to be raised, not least, for instance, the plight of the Rohingya people who have suffered massive oppression in recent time and, of course, have had their identity cards taken away and have been persecuted in all sorts of ways, to such an extent that Queen Mary University in the United Kingdom has now clearly categorised the situation in Burma as having been genocide. So I think that those are very serious aspects of what we're talking about that really, really need to be talked about and analysed very clearly.
Yes, well, we'll come back to the situation of the Rohingya in a short while, but Lilianne Fan first. This is, or it looks as if it's going to be a huge victory. Does that mean that we're seeing the beginning of the end of the military regime, do you think, or is that too much to hope for?
I think we all need to understand that this process of transition was something that was in many ways also designed by the military. So I don't think it's really a case of saying that we're seeing the end of the military. I think they had planned to a large extent, you know, that transition to a kind of democracy would take place. They may not have been expecting the type of landslide victory that the NLD is clearly demonstrating. But at the same time, I think that they have put in place a structure, a political system, which enables them to still have a level of control. So I don't think that it's really accurate to say that we're seeing the end of the military. I think that we clearly are seeing great advances in terms of being able to talk about a democratic process and democratic, you know, progress in Myanmar. But I do think that it's clearly still a country which is going to be under the influence of the military to a large degree. I think a lot of it is going to be about the ways in which the NLD and the government that they've formed is able to negotiate, you know, the levels of authority and, you know, being able to actually build alliances. And I think that those are some of the difficult choices that are going to have to be made by the NLD as well. You know, obviously the constitution itself, if there is going to be a time when we do see a sort of decline in military influence, that has to come through the constitutional reform process. So, you know, to what extent is NLD willing and ready, you know, to make a step as bold as that? I think all of those are questions that are going to be seen.
Baroness Kinnock, Aung San Suu Kyi has been a very determined democracy campaigner, but she's also quite a cautious opposition leader. How do you think that she would react to a situation where she has the moral authority of government, but not all the power of government? Do you think?
Well, she can't be president. So, you know, I mean, that's the first thing that has to be realised. I mean, she cannot, in spite of all the courage, in spite of all the popularity, she can't be president. Emerging from 50 years of a really terrible authoritarian rule is not going to be an easy process. And the military still have rights. They have several, indeed, 25% of seats are reserved for the military still. So when they go into the parliament, then 25% of the seats will be for the military, and they're protected as such, which gives them more power in many ways than the government. So it's progress, but very, very far from being everything that it should be. The reality is, and this is the absolute truth, the military have rights to many unelected seats and will have more power than the government.
Lilianne, do you think that when Aung San Suu Kyi said famously in the press conference just a few days before the election that she would be above the president, do you think that was an indication that she's unlikely to accept this situation without contesting it, and contesting it quite forcefully?
Well, it's clear that she can't, as Baroness rightly mentioned, she can't be the president under the current constitution. So, I think she's really indicating that she is not going to let that restriction stand in her way of leading the government somehow. So she I think, was making a strong statement that, she is going to be the one in charge. She is going to be the head of the government. She may not be the president, but she's going to think of creative ways in which she is actually going to be the one in charge of the government. The specifics haven't been discussed. I think there was some concern as well about, the kind of boldness of that statement from people who were saying, well, that sounds a bit dangerous, actually. What are the implications of having this kind of, super type of authority, if you like? And I think, again, all that needs to be seen in the coming weeks and months when they do actually start to form a government. What is actually going to be negotiated? There probably suddenly a few options that she's already considering in terms of who she might talk to take that position as the president. So is she going to sort of make a compromise with former USDP with USDP, for example, or is she going to put in place a president from the NLD? I think all of these are things which we're going to have to see. But clearly, she Aung San Suu Kyi is very clear that she's going to be the one who's going to be in charge.
Baroness Kinnock, you were talking when you first contributed to the discussion about the situation of the Rohingya, and we heard in that report some Muslims, despite the fact that the opposition avoided the question to put it in its most favourable light during the election campaign, that the situation might improve for them. Do you think it will?
No, I don't. I think the days when they could live in harmony together are probably not going to be possible anymore. There have been improvements in some aspects, as we've just been saying, but in those rights to freedom, I don't anticipate that we will see substantial improvements. They're about, for the Burmese Muslims, they're about 5% of the population, and the NLD talk a lot about democratic transition, but for them, democratic transition has actually brought only misery and terrible suffering to them. So I don't know how they're ever going to retrace their steps and do something about the communal violence and do something about the state of people in the camps. And so it's not just Rohingya, it's other Muslims as well, who have been actually forced from their homes, living in terrible camps, no identity cards, Buddhist extremists still there. Neither of us mentioned that in this discussion, but the role of the Buddhist extremists is, of course, very important. They are never going to contemplate the possibility of opening the door to those people.
Lilianne, in a way, the NLD, partly because they fought shy of raising the issue in the election campaign, are going to be judged by what happens to the Rohingya and other minorities, aren't they?
Very much so. I mean, I have to say that I was a bit surprised at just some of the footage just now, which shows, quite a hopeful tone from some Muslim citizens. I'm sure that opinion does exist, but certainly from what I've heard from Burmese Muslim friends, the feeling is one of, on the one hand, being encouraged by the fact that finally there's a form of democracy. So many people have had a right to vote, including many of the Burmese Muslim citizens who are recognized as citizens, but at the same time that they haven't been allowed a political voice. And I think that for those who are recognized as citizens, as Baroness Kinnock has mentioned as well, it's not only the Rohingya who are extremely discriminated against. And I think that we need to realize that, in fact, for the Burmese Muslims, they view this currently as a sort of a, it's actually a backtracking, because it's the first time in the history of post-colonial Burma, in fact, where you haven't had Muslim MPs. You haven't actually had that political voice represented by any Muslim, any Muslim figures. And that's something I think we need to realize, that there's a process that's underway in the country, which has been very worrying. There's increasing intolerance. There have already been a series of laws that have been passed by the parliament in the last few years that have really been almost targeted against Muslims, and they deal with issues like polygamy or looking at issues of religious conversion, and it's all sort of done in a context where there's been so much propaganda, which is very much Islamophobic. And that's only talking about the Muslim population who are recognized as citizens, but it's even worse for the Rohingya in the sense that they're not even recognized as citizens. They did, in spite of not having citizenship, there have been times in the past when they have been allowed to actually have a say. They were allowed to vote in 2010, for example. That was obviously part of something which USDP was perhaps, they perhaps allowed them the means to vote, the right to vote, perhaps as a political tactic. But at the same time, I think we need to see that the political rights are, in fact, really being lost in a very dramatic way. Even in a situation like Rakhine, where the Rohingya have been for so long disenfranchised and have faced discrimination for decades. Institutionally, I think that in many ways things are getting worse, and it's not going to be easy for the NLD to change that overnight. And I think a lot of Muslims are also not very sure about what the NLD's position on some of these issues actually is going to be. Even with the USDP government in the past, over the past few years, they have not been able to improve the situation in Rakhine State, and it's quite unlikely that the NLD is going to have an easy time improving the situation there either. And as was already mentioned by Baroness, indeed, there's a lot of discussion now about actually what the types of levels of discrimination and the kinds of crimes against humanity that we're seeing in Rakhine State amount to. A lot of credible organizations now are calling this genocide, or at least that we're on the road to genocide. And I think these are all, that was already something that, in fact, was dismissed by Aung San Suu Kyi in her recent press conference. She said this was an exaggeration. There is a debate on, whether it is the case or not, but whatever you call it, the situation is absolutely atrocious.
Okay.
And is unacceptable.
Okay, Lilianne Fan, thanks very much for that. Baroness Kinnock, thank you very much for joining us, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this part of the programme. Do rejoin us for the second part of the show, where we'll be looking at the meeting between US President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first since relations deteriorated over the nuclear deal between the world powers and Iran. Don't go away.